Yeah, as such. Yeah. And he also talks about the struggle of the living, right, to maintain itself at ease in every way in nature. So in one sense, he doesn't say expanded, he just says at ease. So in a sense, what he's really and what I begin to extrapolate from that is that when he talks about the organism trying to maintain itself at ease, it's to organize responses and to maintain itself effectively in response to this pulsation and to the experience of pulsation and to the response of of the self regulating itself in relationship to the environment and the environment's impact or attempts to respond to the self in that environment. It's a little heady, but stay with me. But more fundamental to this, and I think the key for Wright and Neil in their letters is that there's no system for this. There are fundamental principles, but there's no system. It's not, and the difficulty, and Wright talks about how hard it is for his students, right? And Neil talks about it from the perspective of the kids who were at his institution, which we would ordinarily call a school. But Neil, and we'll get to that, never referred to it as a school. It was an environment, or a living environment. But the difficulty that most of the people who respond to this is that they really can't accept the fact that this is not something that lends itself to systematic organization and systematic, control or direction. So classically, a very, she's now deceased, but a very fine scholar, educational and activist, social activist who had worked with Dr. Reich, who was also the wife of Victor Sobey, Francine Sobey, who had done a number of pieces on self-regulation under Reich's direction when she was young. When it came time to deal with self-regulation with her own child, was convinced she could figure out the pattern of the child's self-regulation. Dr. Sobey always used to like to point that out as an example of just how easy it is to get caught in the idea that there's a way to find the system of self-regulation, and once you do that, you're missing the point, or you've missed the boat in that sense. It simply is. So as I like to sometimes play with students, it goes back to the fundamental it is. And what it is, and it is what it is.
What is it?
Yeah, as Mel Brooks might say, it is. It simply is. Right? Woody Allen might spend more time trying to do something with it. David would be more of an expert on that. I'm Woody Allen. So it is how we express ourselves if we are free and rooted in nature. And and in one sense, there's no answer to that here. I mean, certainly not in these lectures, at least not from my lecture. To some extent, and we'll talk about that in the discussion on clinical applications, clinical implications, to some extent what we deal with in therapeutic modalities, or what we deal with in trying to create educational or learning environments or nurturing environments, as Neil preferred to call them, child-rearing environments, is to find out, how that can happen, how we can, how that is experienced, in a free contact with nature. In one sense, the baby knows it instantaneously. And part of the problem is that, as Wright pointed out in a number of cases, the baby can't explain it. Baby can't tell you, can't communicate, directly or cognitively, certainly, with you as to what that experience is, although it lives it. Okay, so for most, if not all of us, we experience this only in theory, and always through the experience of our armored structures, and that becomes the other key part of, not so much the definition, but understanding the basic concept or the difficulty with this concept, all the discussion, including the discussion here, including the jokes I've made, attempts at trying to root it in our natural setting, in our moment, really is through my armor, and our armor, and the armor of people who have worked with these concepts and written about these concepts, including Reich's own, struggles as well as Neil's struggles and others around them. We can idealize people like Reich or Neil and think that they somehow escaped it, but they didn't. To their credit, Reich, both in interviews that a group of us have been listening to, and in his writing, when you really get into it, fully and sensibly, is very clear about his own limitations often with this, and the limitations of those around him. We experience this in our response, our rigid responses to the environments that we live in, the social organizations, our families, schools, various kinds of work settings, and certainly periods like the 60s, although I should remind you, and it's interesting historically, that much of what we're talking about now, while resonates for those of us who were here with the 60s, it's very often shocking for students if they look historically at this to realize that in the 1890s there were already movements trying to deal with this, if not well before that, probably back to the early 1700s. We go back to the period of the Enlightenment and people like Rousseau and others, there were already examinations of this predicament. This is what I meant to mention to you and David and Wendy when we were talking about opening the windows versus air conditioning. We couldn't get the air conditioning going to the Saturday, so we decided to open the windows. But I remember it can be noisy, so bear with us. So it's not really the first. It's not so much that we come to this for the first time with Reich or Neil, that the implications of this really are rooted in what Reich talked about as liberation movements. And Reich talks about in the Sexual Revolution. Reich talks the book, which is based on 2 essays that Reich wrote in the late 20s and early 30s, that there really is a fundamental yearning in human life forms for liberation, for freedom, in other ways, when we read it, the ability to self-regulate. And these movements emerge with great hope, great expectation, great desire. They usually emerge around specific, what we would call today scientific, but often philosophical or creative explosions. Certainly, with the rise of people like Marx, there was a tremendous explosion but going back to the Enlightenment, with the rise of the early Enlightenment philosophers, there was an explosion of enthusiasm, not just among intellectuals, but it spread out into the public. It produced revolutions, it produced upheavals, produced change in social environment. With the rise of Marx, there was another. We read about Marx intellectually. What you don't look at as much is the impact on the life of most non-intellectual populations, and it changed radically. Not always for the better, but there was an explosion of expansive desire to establish a new way of organizing society and life, liberation. Certainly in the period that Reich and Neil emerged, there was one of these explosions emerging initially from the work. The real impetus was particularly the work of Freud. And often today, since it's easy, to criticize Freud and see Freud as stuck in certain types of time frames and cultural references, we miss just how liberating Freud's work was to the masses, not just the intellectuals.